Good afternoon. My name is Viraf Mehta, and in a sustainability-related journey of over 30 years, the last 15 have been focused on and devoted to what we now call business and human rights. And it's the purpose of these few minutes to speak particularly about the emergence of human rights due diligence and its application and relevance to the context of South Asian business. At least from the Indian perspective, I recall that during the period 2010 and 11, just at the time when the United Nations guiding principles were being formulated, we had our own national discourse in a process that led to the first state-issued or government-issued national guidelines, voluntary guidelines for social, environmental, and ethical issues, actually referred to what was at that time the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework that became the UNGPs around the same time, June, July 2011. And it was subsequently with the issuing of the national guidelines for responsible business conduct, which was placed in the public domain at the end of 2018, where 9 principles, including the specific one on human rights, once again, elucidated the human rights responsibilities of businesses to meet the agreed notion of their respecting human rights. And in the steps that proceeded to be spelt out in these national guidelines for responsible business conduct, human rights due diligence is explicitly referred to. Very simply put, I think, especially for smaller and medium enterprises, as well as large ones, of course, is that human rights due diligence is a key process by which companies identify and take such action to correct risks of human rights impacts wherever they occur, directly, indirectly, in their supply chains, in the community, with their employees, with the consumers, and so forth. It's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time process that one does. I think over the last decade, a lot of progress has been made that contributes to today's evolution of human rights due diligence. And one of them is reporting and disclosure, non-financial disclosure, or human rights reporting, environment and climate change reporting, in so many mechanisms and so many different ways. This has given us a database of information, of best practice, of what's actually happening with gigantic multinational companies, what's happening in different nations. And this contributes to an aspect of human rights due diligence I'll speak about a little more. In the second instance, apart from knowing, finding out, conducting a human rights impact assessment in the geographies and areas that I mentioned, the point would be that companies take note of these findings and take appropriate corrective action to reduce or remove the risk of such human rights violations, adverse impacts that occur. And then establish also a mechanism for tracking progress, whether the investments in energy, time, changes in systems, and so forth have actually led to the desired level of either access to remedy mechanisms, reduction in human rights related risks, and so forth. I think this is where I mentioned earlier that the number of frameworks that encourage reporting on human rights issues, including in India, the Business and Sustainability Report, that has evolved from the NGRBC's BRSR and contains a whole range of questions on human rights issues as well as human rights management processes. So I think for ourselves here in South Asia, smaller businesses, it's the right time to collectively, individually, depending on the business sector and the capacities of such businesses, to partner with civil society organizations in particular who have the orientation, the expertise, and the commitment to improve situations, for example, in global supply chains. And the demand most recently from a range of European and other industrialized or advanced economies is one of a mandatory human rights due diligence, not a voluntary option. And this will continue to drive, I think, arguments in favor of us here in South Asia to evolve our own mechanisms, our own human rights priorities, and demonstrate that these contribute to an overall human rights due diligence in a global supply chain for import. So I think that governments move as, for example, through their public procurement and begin to include increasingly human rights and environmental issues in state level and government level, national level and state level procurement. Once again, I think then a database of information such as what the BRSR package provides is a robust and secure framework of information that we want from businesses across all sectors and across all sizes, but obviously adapted to specific purpose. So I think in conclusion, there would always be a type of view that these add costs, and they do. I think given that we've already agreed that the UNGPs are just over a decade old, but in that 10 years, there's no doubt in my mind that companies have the best and the brightest companies, whether they are Indian multinational, Western multinationals, have put substantial energy into promoting an understanding of business and human rights in a number of ways, which include, I think, in the first instance, a recognition, not an opposition to the notion that business and human rights or human rights has to be applied across the value chain of the company. And this is substantial. Also in times before this was mandated in terms of reporting or human rights due diligence, I think that the argument in this outsourced complex world of supply chains was one of the areas where, honestly, I think Western multinationals have taken the lead. And in respect of civil society, consumer action, complaints about sweatshops and so forth, and the footwear industry and the garment industry have had these discussions for, well over, at least 2 decades. So I think the point there is that certain types of business sectors that were part of our day-to-day life, electronics, toys for children, fast foods, garments, footwear, fashion, mining, came into prominence and attention rather than banks, for example, because of in this age of internet, I think we had the opportunity to be able to connect and see things for what they were, and to be able to raise our voices. So I think transparency, due to technology, has been key in being able not only to identify these issues that we've just discussed, but also to do something about them. So I think the number of initiatives, for example, in certain sectors that are related to fair trade or a better pricing are well known, without mentioning each sector has its own initiatives, whether it's palm oil, whether it's energy, whether it's steel, whether it's footwear, garments, electronics, their own initiatives, which one should importantly note are some very fine examples of what we call MSIs, multi-stakeholder initiatives. So the second recognition, I think, by business, positive sign, is that it recognizes the need for other players to be on the table and add value to the discussions. And some of these multi-stakeholder initiatives, where the voice of workers through trade unions and labor NGOs, environmental NGOs, human rights specialists, have vastly informed discussions on human rights. For example, we were discussing at this conference just yesterday the child rights and business principles, an example of how the United Nations initiatives on migration by the ILO, in which part business are a part. So I think there's one space, obviously, where businesses have had to do things on their own. And maybe if, you'd agree that these artificial silos of climate change and human rights are removed. Some of the finest examples can be seen, I think, in terms of targets that companies have set to have circular energy economies, their waste elimination, their reduction of pollution, their use of energy, their carbon footprint. And of course, these all have an impact on human rights ultimately. And I think on the social side, given that we are speaking together in a totally unprecedented age of the risks to humankind, we are just about emerging from a pandemic like never before in living memory. And I think that, unfortunately, it's taken some of these tragedies, like the pandemic, to once again recall to business that the solutions here required are not in the realm or in the basket of charitable or philanthropic mechanisms. They are really, in the future, a basket of opportunity for such businesses to move in sync with the societies they require to do their businesses in. And those that invest now, collectively or individually, increasingly so, share good practice on the table, inform us that it's possible so others can follow, and make it possible for this to happen requires, honestly, a transformative response in this time and age. It's not the old incremental, slow change, everything's fine. Everything is not fine, and it's urgent. So we recognize that there's already been quite a substantial business transformation in the way that looks at doing business altogether. And in this transition period, if you like, or at least till 2030, when the SDGs inform us of whether we've been successful or not, and how we need to go into the decade after that, it would be hoped that we would not necessarily meet all targets, but at least learn how to meet them and know how to meet them and show that we're meeting them. And lastly, I look forward to, honestly, a period, at least in India, where our business leaders, highly intelligent, informed people, become champions of these issues in the truest sense. So they're identified not only for their prowess in making profits or their philanthropy, but in truly leading Indian business into a land of opportunity and leadership, where she, both on environmental fronts and human rights fronts, surprises and, the world in terms of what it's able to do. And this is my wish for the entire region, of course, not just India, because I think we have the ability to do this. We have many, many characteristics in our nation that inherently support environmental and human rights issues for a very long time. And we also have some of the best and the brightest businesses. So there's no reason why in sync as multi-stakeholder, multi-rights holder groups, we're not able to avail of these opportunities. It's not just reducing risk, it's very much, I think, for all our businesses, a true opportunity. And we have to think that way. My thinking has always been that we have to evolve between, let's say, our major trading partners, mechanisms that are equitable in terms of points of view of Indian, South Asian businesses and others being placed, trade unions, civil society organizations being negotiated. It cannot be a human rights framework developed without consultation that is thrust upon the economies or businesses of South Asian nations. We have to do this in partnership, and this is very much in sync with the UN 10 plus roadmap in terms of at least not just concerted action, but collective action and coherent action. And we have to set aside the resources and the time to build capacities of businesses. This is not just an age where auditing and policing business entities is going to provide results. It's an age where incentivized capacity building, opportunity, and collective action will be at least elements of the road ahead with human rights due diligence.